So, greetings, everybody. Like the previous time, you will find in the chat a string of words, names, titles, which will appear in my talk. I ended my previous talk, so far as I remember, on the word mother. This is a huge topic with Kristeva. But it will have to wait until some other time because it needs its own space and a lot of time to unfold. In the chat, you can find the title of a book I have largely concerned with this topic. It was published in English in 2004. But it was more or less finished 10 years before that. So it's dealing with Kristeva's earlier works. And then there is a short piece, Motherhood and the Machine, which is more concerned with her recent writing, but then it is very short and rather dense. So I'll leave it at that this time. I was asked some interesting questions at the end of our previous seminar, so I decided to enlarge on them. There was the turn in Kristeva's work from linguistics to psychoanalysis, which I introduced and of which I will say more later. But there was also the turn from revolution to revolt, which I barely mentioned. So not surprisingly, one of the questions concerned this term. The other questions related to a thought, pensée, to Georges Bataille and the encounter with the impossible. The connection between Kristeva and Bataille has to pass inevitably via discussion of negativity and the negative, a concept which I take great pains to avoid because, again, it needs a lot of space to discuss. So not today. For those who read French, see Galtsova's review on Kristeva's book on Dostoevsky, Face à la mort, the one which is not yet translated in English. The reference to Galtsova is again in the chat. And you will get more about this encounter in Kristeva's lecture on Dostoevsky. There is a lot to be covered, and I will for sure need the second and the third term to do justice to the genealogy and scope of Kristeva's major concepts. Kristeva returns again and again to the etymological origins and the various words relatable to the Latin word revolvere. Revolution, a derivative of revolvere, is central to her early major work, Revolution in Poetic Language. As I pointed out last time, the study blends a remarkable multiplicity of theoretical approaches as an entrance to a discussion of two great French poets, Lautréamont and Mallarmé, in order to assert that every and any revolutionary societal change is unthinkable without the artistic unsettling of symbolic structures. So there is this great importance which is attributed to artistic practice. The connection of this major work by Kristeva to the events of May 1968 and to the French philosophical moment of the 1960s is not only well understood, it is also discussed by Kristeva herself. So there is again a note in the chat of one of the books in which she does it. Less noticed, as I emphasized last time, is the connection to the failure of the East European communist revolutions. I spoke a lot about this last time, but basically it is both in the east and the west of Europe that early 20th century modernism and avant-garde were an integral part of the overall drive towards revolutionary change. This current was especially radical in Russia, where ultimately a revolution did take place. And you will find in the chat a reference to an exhibition in the New York Museum of Modern Art in 2017, which marked the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. It gives an idea of the scope and the force of this trend. So you'll find a link to this exhibition. Russian formalism, the Prague Linguistics Circle, the juncture of linguistics and literary studies, for which Roman Jakobson coined the term structuralism, and the critical overhaul of these currents in the work of Bakhtin emerged to a large extent with all the controversies and disagreements involved in the process as the theoretical counterpart to the artistic unrest, to the artistic avant-garde. Both sides of this process, the artistic and the theoretical, came into trouble with the consolidation of Stalin's regime in the Soviet Union. After World War II, while similar regimes defining themselves as revolutionary were established in Eastern Europe, the same thing happened there as well. The intellectual purge, whose severity varied in time and space, included psychoanalysis, so it was also under a ban. And it was a ban during the crucial decades when in Western Europe it made its way into practice, but also into the discussion of literature, the arts, and philosophical reflection, and so on. Thus, it came to pass that in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, harassment turned modernism and its theoretical articulations from an initial ally of revolutionary change into a permanent site of clashes with the regime and into a reservoir for opposition and critique. And I'll give you a curious example of the deadly earnestness with which this conflict was taken. The Prague Spring, the political upheaval in Czechoslovakia, which took place in 1968, it was an amazing year. So it was the same year when the youth protests in Paris were at their height. The Prague Spring was attributed to two conferences on Kafka, which were held a few years earlier. It was claimed that the two conferences, which were held in a castle not far from Prague in 1963 and 1968, started the process of the ideological destruction of Marxism, Leninism in Czechoslovakia, and that, according to the memoirs of Antonin Novotny, a communist leader then, these conferences, the conferences on Kafka, caused both moral and economic devastation. And as Kafka turns out to be a major culprit behind the Prague Spring. So I think this example gives an idea about how seriously art and the avant-garde and modernism were taken. To put this long story short, dissenting East European intellectuals saw the purge of the artistic avant-garde at the regime's inception as a major birthmark of the regime's catastrophe. Kristeva's formidable treatise on the revolution in poetic language can be regarded as a transposition into the philosophical and social excitement of 1960s France of the imaginative and intellectual opposition to the regimes in Eastern Europe. Through the prism of the avant-garde and its theoretical ramifications, Kristeva's approach exposed the inherent constitutive failure of the communist revolutions and summoned a sustained challenge to their ideological repressiveness. So what, in counter-distinction to the failed social revolution, is revolution in poetic language? Kristeva takes us to an area of turbulent instability, which she describes as a subject in process. She defines the process itself as a movement of meaning, not reducible to language, but encompassing, so including language as the site of language's production and renewal. She situates the process in the dichotomy of semiotic, so this is her conceptualization of the semiotic, le semiotique in French. An ordering before and beyond meaning as rhythm, sound, and so on and so forth, color, abstract color, and symbolic, the realm of syntax, logic, and the law. And she calls this process signifiance. We talked about it some last time, and I'll say a little more about it today. Signifiance is a process of innovative productiveness in which both the subject and the linguistic sign are shattered and made anew. It pushes the individual's need for the singular and the need for the universal to their limit. It has border psychosis on the one hand, so the artist who brings messages, so to say, from this encounter with the coming into existence of meaning in the subject is risking psychosis. And on the other hand, various regimes of authoritarian stabilization, of fundamentalist and totalitarian attitudes on the other. So as a counter motion, as an attempt to resist the dangers of psychosis, there is the opposite risk of embracing totalitarian ideologies, and Kristeva has done a lot of research on this. So to quote her, by radically destabilizing the subject, this process, and I quote, leads to the risk of new defenses, false and deadly in other ways. In the years between revolution in poetic language and sense and nonsense of the revolt, I mentioned this book last time, it appeared in the mid-90s. This period marks Kristeva's second major turn to the problematic of revolvere. In these years, Kristeva's work engages with an in-depth analysis of the risks of signifiance, risks which are individual but also social. So from the lures of suicide to the seductions of fascistic mobilization. In doing this, she keeps refining her terminological apparatus and displacing the focus of her multidisciplinary theoretical instruments from linguistics to psychoanalysis. A significant detail, very interesting detail, is that while in the revolution in poetic language, the panoramic investigation of the process of signifiance unfolds as an articulation of revolution, the term revolution itself is never really subjected to scrutiny in this early work. The word revolution appears with multiple qualifications. It appears as social, socio-economic, industrial, cultural, sexual, permanent, bourgeois, French, proletarian, workers, surrealist, poetic, subjective, Marxist revolution, Freud's revolution, and so on and so forth. Sometimes also revolt appears, sometimes opposed, sometimes more or less synonymous to revolution. Yet in counter-distinction to Kristeva's attentiveness to the semantic and semiotic restlessness of other concepts, this one, the concept of revolution, is not problematized in the revolution in poetic language. And it is easy to understand why. It was a concept that was transparent and self-evident in this epoch. When Kristeva returns in a major way to this problematic at the beginning of the 1990s, now in the form of revolt rather than revolution, this is no longer the case. There is, for example, the term's appropriation in advertising. So between the 60s and the 90s, there is this big change, which trivializes, I'm just giving one example, which trivializes the meaning of revolution by reversing its turbulent promise of risk, transformation, renewal, to the promise of immediate satisfaction through the next revolutionary product or price on the market. This change is also accompanied by the perception, which Kristeva shares, that political movements are permeable, I'm quoting here, permeable to dogmatism. And hence political revolutions inevitably betray the questioning which brings them about. So there is some inherent danger in political movements to get transformed from revolution into dogma. And here I quote what Kristeva says: "I would have never insisted sufficiently on the fact that totalitarianism is the result of a certain fixation of revolt in something which is precisely its betrayal, i.e., that is, a suspension of the retrospective return, which amounts to the suspension of thought." So if we suspend the retroactive return, examining it again and again, the motion, the movement that brought us to a certain point, this, she says, amounts to a suspension of thought. We stop thinking and we begin to accept things as a dogma. This statement allows to realize that the revolution in poetic language is already dictated by the need for retrospective return. So even this early book is a retrospective return because it goes back to the topic of revolution, to re-examination of revolution, and re-examination it in terms of what poets like Lautréamont and Mallarmé did. So it is a resuscitation of revolt from its fixation and betrayal. In the 1990s, however, what prompts Kristeva to take to task not only the problem of revolution, but also the problematization of the term itself, is this new grand upheaval in Eastern Europe. So we're always doing something restlessly here. The 1989 velvet, or incidentally not so velvet, revolutions. As revolutions which were perceived not quite correctly. And here I give you a title of another of my books, which appeared in English, Lost Unicorns of the Velvet Revolutions. They were seen, what was seen wrong is they were seen as simply the cancellation of the previous revolutions. So it was inevitable that this phenomenon produced a neutralization of the term itself. Revolution stopped meaning anything in a way, and it led to the need for its re-examination. The re-examination brought into focus once again the problem of the earlier revolutions, and as Kristeva puts it in the 90s, I find it a beautiful phrase, the Stalinist strangling of the culture of revolt. So there's the strangling of culture of revolt is strangled, it's suffocated. The strangling of the culture of revolt contributed, she observes, to the two, and I quote, the two impasses where we are caught today. the failure of rebellious ideologies on the one hand, and the surge of consumer culture on the other. End of quote. To this, we should add Kristeva's concern with the society of the spectacle. She returns again and again to its effects. And now, in the recent years, the present-day society of hyper-connectivity and its risks. We might say today that we are bombarded by simulacra of revolutionary ideologies from above, from the financial and political elites, through media, old and new, which strangle the culture of revolt much more successfully than Stalin ever did. Kristeva's turn in the 1990s to revolt is a stratagem for rescuing the revolutionary spirit from the betrayal of revolutions. It is a rehabilitation of the microscopic, intimate, but indispensable dimensions of the phenomenon. To do this, she resurrects the meanings of the Latin word I already mentioned, revolvere, as revolving, orbiting, describing a circle, return. The planets, for example, revolve around the sun. Their movement around the sun used to be called revolutions. Kristeva shifts her focus. In her early work, she rescues revolt through revolution. In the 1990s, she saw her goal in rescuing revolt from revolution. Beyond the individual and the singular, there is Kristeva's emphasis on the need for a cultural return. So she always, the emphasis is on the individual, but it is also simultaneously an emphasis on culture. So she sees her goal as what should be our goal is retracing in the steps of modernity in order to find out what went wrong and possibly do it better this time. Kristeva frames this return with an etymological and genealogical recollection of the vicissitudes of the word itself, the word for revolt and revolution. She goes back to the Latin word volvere with its derivatives signifying curve, entourage, turn, return. She includes in her examination the Sanskrit rule with its meaning to discover, open, once again to turn, to return. She brings up the astronomical meaning, referring to the revolution of a planet around the sun, with its connotations of eternal return. She involves the philosophical implications from the Platonic anamnesis, which means anamnesis, recollection, all the way down to the psychoanalytical probing with its powers and limits. The implications that being is within us is this the Platonic, but also the psychoanalytic implication that being is within us, and that the truth can be acquired by a retrospective search, by recollection, by memory. It is during the Enlightenment, actually, and thanks to Voltaire, she reminds us, that the word revolution profoundly alters its meaning from astronomy to history, from the spatial to the temporal, from the cyclic to the unprecedented. So she recollects this change in her rethinking of revolt. What she does by turning to revolt is go behind this alteration and recollect the prime meaning. Revolution as a bridge in time oriented towards singing tomorrows, which this is how she sees her earlier concern with revolution. It is a bridge in time, future oriented towards singing tomorrows. Now it is replaced by notions of reversal, abjuration, change, detour, cycle, recovery, unfolding, reassessment. Not a simple recollection, however, not a simple repetition of that which has taken place, but in Mallarmé's words, which Kristeva repeatedly quotes throughout the years, a prior future. What future have we lost? So this is in a way the question. What are the futures that we lost? And are they worth recovering? But we have to remember first, before we know whether they are worth recovering. The return leads an individual, but also society, to question their truth. So not destruction, not obliteration, not erasure, as in the new pharaoh destroying the monuments of the previous pharaoh, as we know it happened in ancient Egypt, but a modification, a displacement of the past, which occurs as an opening, as a prior future open to the possibility of happening. And so Kristeva's answer to the stalemates of the 1990s was the juxtaposition revolt-revolution. It should be noted that in East European Marxist dogma, and I emphasize dogma because there are many ways in which Marxist thought has been and can be read, and turning it into dogma would be the gravest mistake, the gravest misreading of his theory. So according to this dogma, revolt is a spontaneous phenomenon deprived of rational understanding and clear goals. So you need understanding, you need goals clearly articulated, and you need party discipline, you need a social movement in order to transform revolt into revolution. Kristeva's conceptualization, therefore, is a critique of this understanding of revolt as miscarried revolution. At the same time, in discussing revolt, she remains close to her own conceptualization of revolution in a number of ways. So although she seems to change, to alter, to introduce a novel perspective, there is a great closeness and connection between her own treatment of revolution and her later treatment of revolt. And the most fundamental, perhaps, is her emphasis on the individual, on the individual subject, on inner space, on the passions of art and thought. Kristeva's turn to revolt is elaborated in a series of books. There are the 2 volumes on the powers and limits of psychoanalysis, the sense and nonsense of revolt and intimate revolt, which are dedicated to Aragon, Sartre, and Roland Barthes, as representatives, these 3 figures as representative of the intellectual and political challenges that have marked the 20th century. These books were followed by Kristeva's 3 volumes on the female genius. So her books on Melanie Klein, on Hannah Arendt and Colette. You will find all these titles in the chat, whom Kristeva regards not so much as representative, but as each of them singular. So in the case of female genius, she emphasizes the singularity. But nevertheless, she grounds this singularity in the universality of a theoretical exploration of the formation of female subjectivity. So this is one of the interesting trends of her thinking on which we will focus in future times. Kristeva thus examines the cultivation of revolt on the one hand through the prism of heterogeneous male representation, emphasizing that at this specific moment, the revolt represented by these 3 figures, Aragon, Sartre, and Barthes, faces resistance and rejection. So in a way, she's trying to recollect their importance through her books. On the other hand, through the prism of feminine singularity, Kristeva offers a solution to the cultural ramifications of any difference. So this is an important moment also in her thought. How do we deal with difference? By allowing singularity, allowing the singular aspects of each person. So, but in all these cases, she emphasizes the courage of her protagonists to follow their own exploratory adventures. The 5 volumes present simultaneously a continuation, an elaboration, and an analytic reassessment of a number of issues which subtend her exploration of the dynamic of revolt in the revolution in poetic language, including femininity, or rather the feminine as she has conceptualized it in her most recent writing, the shattering of identity and the stakes of risky and questioning subject vis-a-vis society, the state, and political movements. Although one cannot address the one without addressing the other, there is a change of perspective, however, from the side of the emerging speaking being to the side of the inverse movement of going back of the recollection, which makes the process of the subject visible. The emphasis in the revolution in poetic language is how does the subject come into being? With the turn to revolt, the emphasis becomes how does the subject recollect its coming into being? Actually, I'm making a jump here and a leap to things which we might discuss later. There is a similar change in perspective in her discussion of motherhood and maternity. In her earlier work, it is mostly seen from the perspective of the child. So each of us has been a child, and we had a mother, and it is from the point of view of this coming into being of the subject with the perspective of the child towards maternity that things are seen. And in her latest work, she seems to have switched to the point of view of mothers and to maternal passion, as she calls it, from this point of view. But we're not going to enlarge on this today. Now we go back to Kristeva's shift from linguistics to psychoanalysis, because in fact, her rethinking of revolution as revolt is bound up with the shift. So they go together. Throughout these terms, the concept of signifying persists, however. So this is a term which is present in all of her work. Unlike psychoanalysis, which I mentioned, is abandoned. Since psychoanalysis is defined by Kristeva as a method for describing, signifying phenomena while analyzing, criticizing, and dissolving phenomenon, meaning, and signifier, the relinquishment of this particular neologism and its replacement by the more traditional notion of psychoanalysis is in itself indicative. The full theoretical elaboration of the implications of this change however, comes comparatively late. So she has a number of works already written in this vein before she comes to a theoretical reassessment to make this term clear. So the various results of these studies are brought together conceptually through the examination of 3 distinct stages that Kristeva discerns in Freud's views on language, and that she brings into focus through her own theory of signifiance. I find this discussion of Freud's models of language by Kristeva in the sense and non-sense of revolt extremely important, because it demonstrates that Kristeva's psychoanalytic turn was not a turning away from linguistics, but rather, it's so to say, giving flesh and blood to linguistics. We could use another term which Kristeva elaborates later on, transubstantiation. So transforming, becoming, the word becoming flesh and blood, linguistics becoming flesh and blood. Kristeva discerns three models in Freud's work. The first one is pre-psychoanalytic and belongs to the time when Freud is a neurologist. At the pre-psychoanalytic stage, Freud's preoccupation is with the gap between the sexual and the verbal, with the impossibility for the sexual to be put into words. And here we come to the question about the encounter with the impossible. One of the interesting questions that I was asked last time. The impossible that concerns Kristeva in the case of a thought is not the physical impossibility to open a door or visit Mars. It's physically important right now to go to Mars, unfortunately. But she's interested not in this type of impossibility, but in this gap that opens between my sexuality and my speech. And so Kristeva continues in this early Freudian model, which is pre-psychoanalytic. Sexual desire remains asymptotic to language and intellect. I love this word, asymptote. You'll find it in the chat. It is describes a most curious curve in geometry, which in literature is used metaphorically, of course, to express something that tends to get closer and closer to another thing, but will never, it will only touch it in infinity. So ever more close, but never really touching. So this is desire, and sexuality, sexual desire remains asymptotic to language and intellect. However close we try to get to it, the two things never touch and never coincide. An especially pertinent aspect of Freud's first model, though, is the psychological schema of which he presents there, of word presentation, thing presentation. So he makes this distinction, which envisions a series of levels of representations. So it's a multi-layered complex of perceptions belonging both to the thing, so the thing as image, sound, smell, tactility, motion, and to the words, because we can say, we can hear, read, write a word. So again, the word in itself involves phonetic, graphic, motor, material aspects. And Kristeva foregrounds, here I quote, Freud's assertion that language puts thought and perception on the same level, not abstract language, but she says the language the child learns, that of passionate and amorous communication. And she asks, what kind of speech affects both thought and perception? So we go back to the example with the locked door from the question last time. The psychoanalytic query would be, why locked door? Why this example? What is being locked in? What is being locked out? What act is being perceived as impossible? In Freud's pre-psychoanalytic model of language, we find him reflecting on speech, which affects both thought and perception, and which is nevertheless asymptotic to the body, to sex, to desire. No matter how close it gets, the meeting point is in infinity. This gap, Kristeva points out, will in many ways be downplayed in Freud's optimistic second model. The second model seems to trust the capacity of language to articulate the sexual and the somatic. And then she says the gap between flesh and language returns psychoanalytically elaborated in Freud's third model. It is easy to see that Freud's third model of language is the one that subtends the trajectory of Kristeva's psychoanalytic term in her work from the 1980s. I mentioned quite a few of Kristeva's works so far, so let me now try to organize them in terms of chronology. And I will give the years of the French publication. And I have given in the chat a link to a bibliography, a very full, possibly absolutely complete, well, not absolutely complete, if we have in mind all the many translations of her work, but a very good bibliography of Christopher's work. You'll find a link in the chat. So there is first the early linguistic structuralist or post-structuralist, depending on definitions and interpretations, period from Kristeva's first book Semiotiké in 1969 to Polylogue in 1977. Then in the 1980s, there is the psychoanalytic turn from Powers of Horror in 1980 to Strangers to Ourselves in 1988, and including Tales of Love and The Black Sun in between. Then there is the period from 1990 to the early 2000, I would say 2004, which is the turn to revolt. Kristeva's first novel, The Samurai, first novel ever. She wrote quite a few after this, but her first novel, The Samurai, appears in 1990 to be followed by others. Apart from the books on the powers and limits of psychoanalysis with Aragon, Sartre part, and on the female genius, this period includes, importantly, Kristeva's massive study on Marcel Proust's Time and Sense, which appeared in 1994. The books on Proust and the book and on Colette, the book of Colette is otherwise a part of the Female Genius series. The books on Proust and Colette, which are separated by a decade, the book on Colette appeared in 2004, form a sort of diptych, I believe, of their own, and mark another shift in Kristeva, which we might describe as a shift from lyric, as in the classical division of epic, drama, and lyric. So a shift from lyric to epic, from poetry to novel. A revolution, so in her earlier emphasis on revolution, she was dealing with poetic language even when writing about novels, as she did, for example, in her essays on Philippe Souler's novels, while Revolt ushers in Kristeva's interest in narrative and the imaginary. So there is sort of also a shift in her interests regarding genre. After the book on Colette in 2004, Kristeva's work turns to directions which I will not to summarize now. So her most recent work, as they will take us too far. Suffice it to say that they are marked by a growing hybridity between the theoretical, the fictional, and the biographical. Kristeva's books on Saint Teresa, Teresa, My Love, and her most recent books on Dostoevsky exemplify this trend, this type of hybridity of fiction and theory and biography, and autobiography. The sickness of ideality, the need to believe, nihilism, the objection of motherhood, the dynamic of the feminine are some of the issues that get foregrounded in this latest period. And you will hear more about this in her own lectures. Going back to Kristeva's analysis of Freud's three models of language, what she does is emphasize those aspects of his first pre-psychoanalytic model, which prefigure important aspects of his third model, where they acquire a full-fledged psychoanalytical implementation. This third model subtends Kristeva's psychoanalytic turn, which relies on Freud's register, and I enumerate these important concepts: identification, in German it's Einfühlung, idealization, and sublimation. So in Tales of Love, in Black Sun, and elsewhere, these concepts are theoretically elaborated, both through a direct exegesis of Freud's work and through analysis of artistic production. Kristeva's remarkable input into this grid, to this trio, conceptual trio, is her own conceptualization of objection in Powers of Horror. And we can talk a little bit more about objection, if you like, in the question and answer period. So the concepts, as I enumerated them, unfold their own story. Before knowing what or who it is, the subject to be asks, where am I? So it's a question of space with which we begin. Where am I? And finds itself persecuted by the horror of its initial non-differentiation from the maternal body. It's objection, is Kristeva's term, objection. The subject then identifies through a metaphoric leap with the imaginary father, Einfühlung, identification, who is in fact an ambiguous amalgamation of mother and father. So it's a father capable of loving like a mother. It's a mother, but not quite, because it's this type of ambiguous figure. What follows is the narcissistic idealization of one's own image through this move. And this idealization abandons sexual aims. It is therefore a desexualization. So it is sublimation. That is, and this is one of the most complicated issues in Kristeva's work, and she returns again and again to this, by dissociating the life and the death drives. This idealization, sublimation, liberates the death drive. And rather than providing a safe haven, however, it opens the way to depression and melancholy. And then this peril can be averted by resexualizing the sublimatory activity itself. And again, Kristeva emphasizes this again and again. Literature and the arts hypostasize this resexualization that is the destiny of every human being. And they do it either by directly introducing erotic fantasies or by concentration on the sublimatory act itself and its product. So we invest eroticism in fantasy and in our dealings with art. All this may look too subjective, but Kristeva insists it is in fact the groundwork of social, historical, and civilizational processes. In the sense and non-sense of revolt, Kristeva identifies her own concept of signifiance with Freud's third model of language. She thus links signifiance with the modalities of identification, idealization, and sublimation, as observed in the analytical as well as in aesthetic experience. Set in the most general terms, as a concept, and I quote, expressing the process, dynamic, and movement of meaning, not reduced to language, but encompassing it. So it's not just language, but language is in this process. This notion of signifiance does not seem to differ from the one that is operative in her early work, in Semiotique and Revolution in Poetic Language. So she's giving this description in her discussion of Freud's models of language in the framework of her discussion of revolt. And from this point, given like this, it doesn't seem to differ very much from what we find in the earlier work in the Revolution in Poetic Language. In both cases, Kristeva insists on the translinguistic and heterogeneous character of signifiance, which does not separate drives and words and is organized in intermediary structures. In both cases, literature is explored as a hypostasized locus of these processes, with modernist literature a privileged example. In both cases, the seemingly subjective and intimate range of the processes involved is posited as fundamentally implicated in the constitution and renovation of the social and the political, of history and civilization. And there are other similarities, this is not all. Yet there are also significant differences. The emphasis on the semiotic, which is still there. This is also one of Kristeva's persistent concepts, gives way to transubstantiation in the later work. As again, we can talk about it some more. Narrative, which in the early work is recognized as susceptible to revolution, but barely. So narrative doesn't play a great role in her early work. In her later work, it is foregrounded. The triple modality, or we might say quadruple, if we include objection, of identification, idealization, and sublimation, which play no role in the early work, rehabilitate the imaginary in the later work. So imaginary, precisely in so far as it is concerned with imagination, but also with the image's vision, acquires a different status in the later work. Again, to draw a major difference, we have subversion, shattering, pulverization in the first case. So the emphasis is on this shattering of language, of syntax, of the subject. While in the stage of revolt, in the case of revolt, there is an amnesis which, out of forgotten memory and fantasy, brings forth a new birth, new flesh, reincarnation. So this is in the second case. So in this second case, the story of what was forgotten, we might say, brings into being what never existed. This is the type of paradox it involves. So the question is, are we dealing with a more nuanced and more comprehensive elaboration of the same concept of signifiance? Or are we actually dealing with a concept surreptitiously smuggled in and fundamentally different? It's the same name, but the concept is, in fact, not the same. It's something else. And here I'll give my own interpretation of what's going on here. In her discussion of Freud's optimistic model of language, the second one, Kristeva brings forth an interesting problem related to Freud's essay, The Antithetical Meaning of Primal Words. It's in your chat. In this essay, Freud compares the functioning of the unconscious to certain so-called primitive languages, but it includes Latin, in which the same word might express two opposite ideas. For example, deep and high. The linguistic observation was taken up by Freud as a proof for his claim that the unconscious does not recognize contradiction. Kristeva identifies this Freudian claim as an error, as the error subtending Freud's optimistic model, and quotes linguist Emile Benveniste, I mentioned him last time, who points out that this claim in regard to language, and I quote, did not consider the position of the subject of the enunciation in the act of discourse. Indeed, if the same word signifies deep and high, it is because the subject of the enunciation has moved. The subject is high atop a ladder when saying that the well is deep, and at the bottom of the ladder when commenting on its height. While this problem is considerably larger in its linguistic, anthropological, or philosophical implications, it may also provide the proper perspective for understanding the convergences and divergences in Kristeva's conceptualization of signifiance. She proposes, in fact, two optics for signifiance as the process producing meaning and the subject. The first optic, signifiance one, we might say, is observed, so to speak, from the bottom of the ladder, and the second, signifiance two, from its top. For example, when speaking of literature, one end of the ladder would reveal the semiotic shattering and scission we find in avant-garde poetry. The other end would reveal it, as to put it in terms of Kristeva's discussion of Colette, flesh of the world, transubstantiation. So far as literature and art in general are concerned, this bifocality makes an aspect emerge in which the two optics overlap, and it is experience. Experience is transversal to the distinction between semiotic and transubstantiative, between abstraction and incarnation, between avant-garde poetry and modernist novel. It appears from both sides of the ladder. And I'll stop here for today.